Hello and welcome to my video all about how to make your own foot cozy. This project came about because my feet are always the first parts to get cold and yet are the slowest to heat back up again. So I basically made a mini bed for my feet, into which I can also put a rice warmer to make it even toastier. To do this project you're going to need some fabric. The fabric that you're going to need for the main bulk, if not all of the foot cozy, needs to be fairly sturdy, so something like a canvas or a denim is perfect. I personally used 3 different types of fabric, but for the main body of the foot cozy I used Dogwood denim, which I bought from an online shop called Spoonflower. In addition to that, I also just used a small piece of Calico for the pouch section inside, plus a piece of fluffy faux fur. And you shouldn't need to buy any more than 1 meter in length. You'll also need a sewing machine with matching thread, a hand sewing needle, some stuffing and batting. You can use foam instead or even just batting, it's up to you. A tape measure, a ruler, some scissors including some fabric scissors, a magic or disappearing fabric pen, a pencil and piece of paper, some sewing pins, an iron and ironing board, press studs or velcro strips if you want to add a faux fur lining, and a rotary cutter and cutting mat if you have them. And if you want to add some heat to your foot cozy, you'll also need a microwavable rice warmer. Right, so the first step is to cut out the pieces of fabric. This cozy will consist of 5 main pieces of fabric. The wall and the floor of the inner part of the cozy, the wall and the floor of the outer part of the cozy, and a thin strip that joins the 2 parts together at the top. The first thing we need to do is work out how big all of these pieces of fabric need to be. To do this, we need to decide how big we want the foot cozy to be on the inside. So put your feet comfortably together and measure an imaginary rectangle on the floor around them. This should be the minimum size of the floor of the inner part of the cozy. In my case, this was 9.5 inches by 11.5 inches. You then need to add 2 times the seam allowance to each of these measurements. I'm going to be using a default seam allowance of 1/2 inch. So the piece of fabric that's going to be the inner floor of my cozy will measure 10.5 inches by 12.5 inches. The wall of fabric that goes around this inner floor will therefore need to be 2 times 10.5 inches plus 2 times 12.5 inches plus 2 times the seam allowance long, which is 47 inches. This might seem complicated, but all you're doing is working out the circumference of the inner floor and then adding 2 times the seam allowance. You then need to decide how tall you want the cozy to be. I personally decided that I wanted mine to be about 5 inches high. So from that we can work out how tall the inner wall needs to be. Now that we've done the calculations for the inner parts of the cozy, it's time to do the same for the outer parts. So to work out the size of the outer floor is very easy because you just need to add 1 inch to the width and the length of the inner floor. And that makes the outer floor 11.5 inches by 13.5 inches. And the outer wall of fabric will need to be 2 times 11.5 inches plus 2 times 13.5 inches plus 2 times the seam allowance long, which is 51 inches. All you're doing here is working out the circumference of the outer floor and then adding 2 times the seam allowance. And this wall of fabric needs to be 1 inch taller than the inner wall, so it needs to be 6 inches tall. So the outer wall will therefore need to be 51 inches by 6 inches. Once you've worked out the size of these 4 pieces, you'll need to cut them out. To do this, you'll need your disappearing fabric pen, a metal ruler, a rotary cutter and cutting mat, or some fabric scissors. This will give you 2 long strips of fabric, one piece a little bit smaller than the other, and also 2 rectangles of fabric, again with one piece being a little bit smaller than the other. Okay, so now most of the hard work is over, so we need to sew these pieces together. We're going to be sewing the smallest strip to the smallest rectangle and the largest strip to the largest rectangle. And that's going to create two open box shapes, one smaller than the other. Take the largest rectangle of fabric and place it right side up. Then what you're going to do is attach the long side of the longest strip around the circumference of this rectangle. Make sure that you keep the fabric pieces right sides together. Start at a corner of the rectangle, making sure to leave 1/2 inch or a seam allowance distance of fabric at each end, unpinned and sticking out from this corner. Then work your way around, lining up the edge of the strip with the edge of the rectangle, pinning as you go. In order to match the corners of the rectangular floor piece, you'll need to fold the strip of fabric at each corner at a right angle. Try and place the sewing pins diagonally at the corners like I have. Then do the same with the inner parts of the COSY. So that's the smaller strip and the smaller rectangle. Note that I placed the rectangle for this box right side down. This is because I wanted the plain white back of the fabric to be displayed on the inside of the COSY. So basically the sides of the fabric that you want to be on the front or the outside of the project should be facing each other in this step. And you just do exactly the same as you did before, to pin the fabric all the way around. And then you should have something like this. Next, you need to use your sewing machine and a straight stitch to sew all around the outside of each of these sections. Remember to sew the seam allowance distance from the edge, in my case 1/2 inch, and backstitch at the beginning and end of each line of stitches. An important note is that you shouldn't sew straight across the corners, but instead you'll need to sew diagonally at 45 degrees, either inwards from a corner when starting a new stitch line, or outwards towards the corner when you're finishing that stitch line. Hopefully these photos will make it clearer. This isn't absolutely vital, you can sew across the corners if you want. I just much prefer the finished look doing it this way. Also, as a last step, remember to sew the short ends of the fabric walls together, again using the same seam allowance. Then open up the box shapes and turn the outer part or the larger part right sides out. It's a good idea at this point to press the seams using an iron, just to make it look a lot neater. So on the outer part of the COSY, press the seams from the outside towards the inside. Then press the seams of the inner part of the COSY from the inside outwards. Next, we need to cut out the upper strip of fabric, which will join the inner and outer walls of fabric at the top. You'll want the length of the strip to be the same length as the outer wall of fabric. So in my case, that's 51 inches long. And then you should make the width of the strip 1 inch plus 2 times the seam allowance. I personally forgot to add the 2 times 1/4 inch seam allowances for some reason, so my strip ended up being a bit narrower than it should have been, as you may notice. Once you've cut out that strip of fabric, you'll need to pin it to the top of the outer wall, right sides together. Start pinning at a corner and make sure that 1/2 inch of fabric at each end of the strip is left unpinned and sticking out from this corner. This is the seam allowance amount. Then sew all along the edge of the strip. I used a narrower seam allowance for this of 1/4 inch. Remember to sew the short ends of the strip together as well. Then at each corner, fold the fabric strip to form a 90-degree angle and pin these folds in position. I then used a sharp hand sewing needle to stitch these folds in place. I used a whip stitch because it's fast and easy, but if you can do an invisible stitch instead, that will be preferable. I used a red coloured thread so that you could see where I stitched, but you would use a matching colour of thread to help it blend in. The next step involves sewing the 2 open box shapes together. So place the larger outer box inside the smaller inner box, so that the right sides of the fabric are facing each other. Pin all along the 2 long edges and along one of the short edges to join the edge of the thin fabric strip to the top of the inner wall. Sew along the top of these 3 sides, making sure that the fabric edges line up. I used a 1/4 inch seam allowance to do this. During this step, make sure that you sew across all 4 corners, but be sure that you leave that short edge completely open. When you've finished the sewing, turn the whole project right sides out through this opening. And now you can see it taking shape. The next step is to add the stuffing to the COSY. So cut out some batting or some foam to go in the floor of the COSY. I cut out 3 pieces of batting the same size as the outer floor. I then inserted the 3 stacked pieces into the floor of the COSY, making sure that they laid flat. I then inserted stuffing into the wall furthest from the opening to pad it out. Once that first wall is padded, take a needle and thread and do a couple of stitches in each corner and in the middle of that wall. This just holds the walls together and helps keep everything in place. In this photo you can see little dimples where I've added the stitches all around the base. So that's in every corner and in the middle of every wall. You only need to do a couple of stitches at each of these points. Then stuff the 2 side walls and do more stitches along those sides, and then finally stuff the wall with the opening in it. And of course add a couple of stitches to the middle of this wall. In order to finish off this part of the COSY, fold the edges of the opening inwards and sew the invisible stitch by hand to close the opening securely. I have a video all about the invisible stitch if you need some pointers. As an optional extra, you can also add a faux fur lining to the COSY. I just cut out a piece of faux fur the same size as the inner floor and then used whip stitch to hem around the edge, although that's not strictly necessary. I wanted this lining to be removable, so I attached it with Velcro strips. You could instead use press studs, or if you want to attach it permanently, you can hand sew it in place. And all that's left to do now is to make the top piece, which is basically just going to sit on top of your feet. It's also going to feature a pouch on the underside where you can put a rice warmer. In order to design the shape of this top piece, you first need to sketch out the profile of the top of your feet. To do this, put a piece of paper inside the COSY and then put your foot next to it. Sketch an outline of the top of your foot and draw a line to represent the top of the COSY. The two lines will create a kind of wedge shape, which you then need to cut out. You then need to use this paper shape as a template to cut out two pieces of fabric. So draw around the template once using your disappearing fabric pen and then add a seam allowance around the outside. Then you must turn the template over and draw around it again. As before, add a seam allowance all the way around. Then cut out these two shapes. These two pieces are going to be at either side of the top piece. And then we need a rectangle of fabric in between to join them. To work out how long this rectangle of fabric needs to be, you first need to measure the circumference of one of these wedge shapes, using a tape measure. Then, as usual, add 2 times the seam allowance. This is measurement A. To work out the width of this rectangle, measure the width inside the COSY now that it's padded, and then add 2 times the seam allowance. This is measurement B. Then cut out a rectangle of fabric that measures A times B. In my case, it works out to be 18 inches by 10 inches. Next, if you want to add a pouch to house a rice warmer, then you'll need to cut out another rectangle of fabric. I decided to use Calico for this rather than the main fabric. The width of this piece will be measurement B plus 2 inches. So in my case, that's 10 plus 2, which is 12 inches. You don't have to add exactly 2 inches. This depends on how big of an opening you want for the pouch. And the length of this piece will be the length of the short edge of the wedge shape plus 2/3 of the length of the curved edge of the wedge shape. Plus, of course, 2 times the seam allowance. You then need to cut out this rectangle and then hem the side where the opening will be using your sewing machine. This is likely to be one of the longer edges. As you'll notice, this pouch fabric will be 1 inch wider on each side than the longer rectangle below. Line up the two rectangles so that one side edge and one bottom edge lines up. Then pin down the side. Once you've pinned one side, then line up the other side and pin that as well. Then sew along these sides using a narrower seam allowance than usual. So in my case, that will be less than 1/2 inch. Right, so the next step is to sew the wedge-shaped sides onto these rectangles of fabric. So first, gather the center of the excess pouch fabric into a pleat, and then pin this in place on the bottom edge. Then take the wedge-shaped side pieces of fabric and arrange them as shown. Flip them both over onto the fabric rectangle, lining up the side edges. The bottom edges should be a seam allowance distance from the edge. Pin them in place and then sew down the sides, making sure to stop sewing a seam allowance distance from the top of those side pieces. Then pin the curved edges of the side pieces to the edges of the rectangle. Make sure that all the fabric edges line up neatly and then sew them together. Again, stopping a seam allowance distance from the end. And finally, pin and sew the final edges of the side pieces onto the edges of the rectangle. And then sew. Then turn the top piece right sides out and fill with stuffing. You want to make it fairly firm. Next, fold the edges of the opening inwards and use a needle and thread to sew the opening closed. Once again, use the invisible stitch. And that's it, the foot cozy is complete. In order to enjoy it to its fullest, you then need to microwave your rice warmer and place it in the pouch. I really hope you've enjoyed this project and thank you very much for watching.